Hello, I'm going to talk to you today about Lab 46 driver's license exam. Uh, let's assume that the local driver's license office has asked us to write a program that grades the written portion of their driver's license exam. And their exam consists of 10 multiple choice questions, and they provided us the correct answers. So what you see here, this 1 through 10, these are actually their correct answers. So our program should store the correct answers shown above in an array named correct answer. We need to make this correct answer array an array of characters because the data that we're storing in each location is a single character. It should then read in the user's answers for the 10 questions and validate the input. An answer can only be an A, B, C, or D. The validated answers should be stored in an array named user answer. So this is what the name of a second array of characters. This is the array of characters we'll be storing the user input into. After the user's answers have been entered, the program should display a message indicating whether the student passed or failed the exam. A student must correctly answer 7 of the 10 questions in order to pass. The program should then display the total number of correctly answered questions and the total number of incorrectly answered questions. So we will be keeping a count of the number of questions that the user gets correct. So we'll be incrementing a counter every time the user gets the right answer. Now it says, hint, you will need parallel arrays to solve this problem. What it's telling you is correct answer and user answer are parallel arrays because the elements are related at the same index. So in other words, correct answer sub 0 is related to user answer sub 0. One is the correct answer, one is the user's answer for the very first question. Correct answer sub 1 is related to user answer sub 1, and so on. Input validation. Only accept the characters A, B, C, or D as answers. All right, I want you to use a do-while loop to validate, and I've given you a hint. The while, the bottom of your do while, can validate the user answers by using this conditional expression. So as long as user answer sub I is less than A or it's greater than D, then it's invalid. So if user answer sub I is less than A or user answer sub I is greater than D, it is invalid. Let me show you the ASCII character chart to help you understand that. So an A is represented as a 65 in memory numerically, a B is represented as a 66, a C is a 67, and a D is 68. Notice they're contiguous. So if some character is input that is not in this range, 65 to 68, then that conditional expression that we wrote will be true, and we will repeat our do-while loop. So notice that every character that is before A in the ASCII character chart is represented by a number that is less than 65, and every character that is after the D in the ASCII character chart is represented by a number that's greater than 68. That's why our conditional expression works in our do-while loop to validate the data. It also says to use constants to define your number of questions and the passing score. So we need 2 constants defined. Size is the number of questions and the number of elements we need to store in our arrays, and passing is the number of questions they have to get right in order to pass the exam. All right, let's look at our input. So here is some sample input, and for this input, our program needs to produce this output. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what we do. When we read in a value, the first thing we have to do is validate it. If it's good data, then we'll leave it in our user answer array, and then we need to go ahead and compare user answer sub I, and I'm assuming I is our for loop counter here. So we need to compare user answer sub I to correct answer sub I. And if they're the same thing, then the user got their answer correct. So we need to increment a counter that is keeping up with the number of answers they got correct. So for example, if we create a variable called numCorrect, then we can just do a numCorrect plus plus when user answer sub I is equal to correct answer sub I. So after we do that, we'll be at the next iteration of our for loop. So if we're using I as our counter, then we'll be at 1. Remember, the first element in an array has an index of 0, so that's why we start our counter out at 0. So the next element will be read into user answer sub 1, and then we'll validate it and determine whether or not it's good data. So if it's less than A or greater than D, it's bad, but this is good data, so we'll leave it in our user answer sub I location in our array, and then determine whether or not the user got the answer correct or incorrect. Remember, if user answer sub I is equal to correct answer sub I, then increment a counter, num correct plus plus. Then we go to the next iteration of our loop, so we'll be at I equal to 2, and we'll be reading into user answer sub 2. So if this passes our validation, then we just leave this in user answer sub I, and we go ahead and compare the user answer to the correct answer array, and if it is the same character, then we go ahead and increment our num correct counter. All right, I wanted to get to this point in the input so I can show you what happens. Here, the lowercase b is greater than the capital D in the ASCII character chart, so we're going to fail our input validation test, and what happens is we just go ahead and go to the very next iteration of our for loop and read in another value and overwrite that B. So this will be overwritten. This B will be overwritten in the user answer sub 3 position in our array. Okay, so we'll go through validating data, iterating through our for loop, and leaving the valid values in the user array and comparing the user answer sub I to the correct answer sub I to determine whether or not they got it correct, and if they did, we need to increment a counter. Okay, we do all this because when we fall out of our loop, we need to output whether or not they passed the exam. This is where we have to utilize that num correct counter and compare it to our constant. Remember, we have this constant up here called passing. So if num correct is greater than or equal to passing, then we're going to output you passed the exam, congratulations. Else we're going to output you did not pass the exam, you may try again. So this is just an if else that outputs that they passed if their num correct is greater than the passing, greater than or equal to passing, else we output you did not pass the exam. The next two lines of output are the requirements to give the user the number they got correct and the number they got incorrect. So we have this counter that was keeping up with the number that they got correct. That's easy. We can output that counter right here. Now, we don't have to keep up with a separate counter for incorrect because you can just subtract the number they got correct from size to determine what this will be. In other words, size minus num correct should give you this answer right here. Likewise, when they fail, same thing. This is num correct. This is the size minus num correct to get that output. All right, I'm going to give you a little help down here in your main method. So you'll have to add your preprocessor directives and using namespace. I just want to get you started on your for loop. Remember that a for loop needs to be used to traverse an array, and you're going to need to define your variables. So I'm going to go ahead and give you some of these. Remember, I gave you hints up there, so I'm going to go ahead and put them in the coding window. And we need a correct answer array, right? And we're going to need a user answer array. So we're going to be getting these and putting them in our coding window. Now let's talk a little bit about the data types here. They both need to be character arrays, right? And also we need to take into account that the correct answer array needs to be initialized using an initialization list. So we need to set its values to the values up here in 1 through 10. So in other words, the first one will be an A, the second element should be a D, and so on. So I'll get you started on that. The first element should be an A. It's a character, so it needs single quotes around it. The next one is a D. The next one is a B. And I'll let you finish. Now, user answer is also an array of characters, but we're not going to initialize it because we're going to read values into it. I'll go ahead and put a semicolon here just so you remember to put a semicolon. All right, those are our variable definitions. Now let's get started on that for loop. Remember I said we need a for loop to read in the grades, not the answers, read in the answers into user answer array. All right, remember a for loop can use I as a counter, and the first element in an array always has an index of 0, so we're going to start our counter out at 0, and as long as I is less than size, we need to read in another element. We'll always increment our counter by 1. Now what do we want to do in the body of this loop? The first thing we need to do is read in our data and validate it. So let me go ahead and give you the CM that will read into our user answer array, a single answer, an element, and we have to do a little bit more because we have to validate that that is good data. So we're going to put that inside a do while, and remember we need to go ahead and indent for our do while. Now remember the while part I gave you up here to validate the answer. So as long as they've given you a bad value, then you're going to read in another one. This will overwrite the answer that was in user answer sub I until they give you an answer that is an A, B, C, or a D. Now remember you need to add the code here to increment a counter when they get the answer correct. So add some code there, and then when you fall out of your for loop, you have everything you need to output the data. And the data we need to output is whether or not they passed. Output the pass/fail information and the number correct and incorrect. So I hope this helps you get started with your program. If you need any help, if you get part of this written and you have issues, remember you can get in touch with me and I'll try to help you troubleshoot your problems.